Hello, everyone, and thank you all for attending our fifth day of the Ethiopia Modern Nation Ancient Truths Conference. Our upcoming session and second session for the day is titled Modernity and Memory, Ethiopia's Histories, and will be moderated by Suraf Al-Wandimo, Assistant Professor at Addis Ababa University. I would just like to mention a few housekeeping details. The duration of the panel is 2 hours, including the Q&A portion of the panel. I would also like to inform you that this panel is being live streamed on YouTube to increase access to across countries that do not have access to Zoom. Thank you again for joining us, and I would like now to introduce Professor Surafel.
Thank you, Satan. Warm greetings to you all from Sharjah. This is Surafel Ondemu, the moderator. First, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Africa Institute for organizing this amazing, critical, brilliant conference film screening. I would like also to thank co-organizers, Professor Salah Hassan, Elizabeth Oldegiorgis, Elsie, Dagmay Wubishet, Dag, and Satan and Sharif. I'm very much pleased to moderate this session in which, these critical emerging scholars, public intellectuals, Netzanet Gebra Mikael and Jonas Ashene are speaking soon. These two intellectuals, along other Ethiopian scholars and other Ethiopianists, are really participating in the process of changing the terrain of Ethiopian studies. So I feel so honored. Thanks to have you with us, Natsi and Yoni. With that, I'd like to introduce Natsi. Netzanet and Jonas and myself, we are friends and colleagues. Netzanet and I did our undergrad studies in English literature at the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at Addis Ababa University. Later, we did our MA studies at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, where we studied contemporary cultural studies. Then Netzanet holds her PhD in social studies from Makerere Institute of Social Research at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. Currently, Netzanet is working with the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, where she also serves as an assistant professor as she teaches in different departments. I'd like to say a few words about Netzanet's intellectual works. In her academic works, Netzanet redirects themes and questions from events to the everyday and the ordinary. So in her intellectual works, Netzanet redirects themes and questions from events to the everyday and the ordinary, from entire preoccupation with homogeneous past to multiple sensibilities of time and place in the present and in the past, and from traditional archive and history to memories. Netzanet does not lose sight of archives, however. She reads archival materials against the grain, and she keeps the tension between the extraordinary and the ordinary. That's my reading, actually. This is evidenced in her writing on topographies of memories, in which Netzanet discusses ordinary people remembering the capital of Eritrea, Asmara, through metaphors of place and time from Ethiopia. In so doing, Netzanet shows what she calls retrospective opening, which allows her to reveal possibilities and impossibilities in simultaneous, this is her term, and multi-layered historical lived experiences. Netzanet's today's presentation, which is titled Women's Reminiscence as Retrospective Openings, Women's Voices on and About the Ethiopian Student Movement, has grown out of such epistemic sensibility and other projects that she has been working on. In today's talk, Netzanet takes the years 1967 in Asmara and 1974 in Addis Ababa and in Ethiopia as points of departure. She takes these years neither as causally linked nor as mutually exclusive. Netzanet rather unravels and moves around the highly valorized narratives of the 1974 revolution and the student movement to read the historical developments of the years 1967 and 1974 in view of seeing multi-layered times as conjuncture. She uses oral recollections, memoirs, novels, films, academic writings, biographies, and so on. That said, I would like to invite Nazannet to present her talk. Then I can also afterwards introduce Jonas so that he can come and present his. Nazi, the floor is yours. By the way, each presentation can take up to 20 minutes. And afterwards, I will just bring a couple of questions to each of the speakers. Then we will open the floor so that the panelists and the rest of the attendees can participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Suri. Is it audible? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Suri, for the very generous introduction. And I hope I will be as articulate as you presented about the work. So just to give a brief background about how I'm thinking about this notion of retrospective opening and reading like different sources simultaneously, and what could be what those reading like along different sources, I mean, kind of putting them together could help us look into resurrecting diverse voices, diverse actors, diverse aspirations of change, depending on the types of sources that are produced in the past, but also from the vantage point of the present, looking back at the past. So before going into the detail, I would want to give where I got this inspiration about this idea of retrospective opening. So my dissertation was about trying to study what could be the nature of history during the neither war nor peace historical rupture between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and what sort of sources could we have to be able to account history during this time, or is it fair for a historian or a social scientist to just say that it's impossible to recover history during this time, or is it perhaps possible to work with what remains from that moment of rupture? So in that investigation, what I have found, I heavily depended on oral history, or mainly oral reminiscence of people who used to live in capital city Eritrea, Asmara, but reconstructs their narrative from Ethiopia. So that way I was trying to interrogate what could be possible. I mean, the potentiality of memory as a site for historical reconstruction, particularly during such times, because such times happens also during this COVID time, whereby, I mean, the traditionally assumed sources are not readily available as a historian would want them to. So what would happen? What sort of sources can we have as alternative source of telling the story of the past during such times? So that was the kind of the investigative research that I was indulging myself into. So during that time, much of the method was to work with whatever I had at that time. So that includes looking at the archive, listening to oral stories, recollections, and also memoirs and autobiographies. All of these sources had to be read together methodically, so as to see the production of memory of the site which is politically inhibited, but trying to historically recover within that dilemma of politics. So then we have the tension between, is it possible to talk about history in a context of a politicized moment? My journey shows that there is no such a time where you don't have politics which produces history. Therefore, one can only openly account for the type of sources that are available and show how one is engaging with them. So extending this methodological sort of journey, one of the ways in which I had gone through that research was kind of anchoring into the oral history and following it through. So one of the thematics of remembering Asmara at the time was most of my informants were, or like the oral interlocutors, were heavily discussing about a moment in Asmara, which is 1967 in Ethiopian calendar, and I didn't want to translate it to 1975 because the term itself was kind of a commemorative moment for most of the for most of the interlocutors, oral interlocutors. Thus, I had to keep that as that which came like from the oral. Then I had to travel with my interlocutors to the archive to be able to see what the archive could tell about 1967, a little bit before and later. So the oral being one of the sites through which I was investigating, as I said, the different ways in which oral accounts were being circulated along diverse sources like the autobiography, songs, memoirs, and also, linking. So then the point of 1967 was much attached to the archive memoirs and novels, which I will discuss a little later. But anyway, so in discussing 1967, most of the informants were very much engaging about their reminiscence of the city Asmara in 1967, particularly around January 23. All of this time were given from the interlocutors. And at that point, I didn't want to only look at 1967, but I had to see the antecedents, the precursors of 1967, which is 1965, 66, 67, and a little later also. So in that investigation, what I have found from the oral account, the Asmara, January 23, 1967 was a phenomenal, extraordinary moment of violence. And thus most of the people who were remembering Asmara brought this event as a conjectural moment of their memory. All of these people, I didn't have a group reminiscing moment, but individuals. So most of the individuals kind of remembered that moment as a phenomenal moment in Asmara, phenomenal in terms of having seen a very violent encounter between the EPLF and the Derg and local population. And so it was a moment of violence. That's how the account was given. Then I had to go to the archive to see what sort of narrative the archive was offering. The archive in 1967, I'm referring to archive from the Wemezekir or National Archive. So the context that comes from the archive was very much similar to the oral, but as you can imagine, these are like dates and letters of administration, like narratives of rule and administration. So in that discussion between the oral and the archive, what I have found was that 1967, just like the oral in the archive, was also retrospectively being reminisced or being recollected for administrative purposes due to a specific type of letters which were coming from women. And this would be the focus of my presentation today. And we can discuss a little bit, we can discuss further about the rest of the situation, but my interest today is to look into the intervention that came from private letters, mostly submitted by women, and retrospectively until 1978, we see like women who are putting, sending litigations to the state, mentioning their husbands, mostly their husbands and sometimes their fathers, who were imprisoned, executed during that violent moment, and are now entering into negotiation with the state to reclaim particularly properties for the livelihood of their family. So it's that moment which captured my attention. There are other narratives also which transpires from the archives, which we can discuss during the Q&A. But my interest here is to kind of look at how archives also retrospectively account for a certain part of a time, which now is 1967, as I said, and the oral and the archival meets in methodically, one in both of them being retrospective. Perhaps this is not something new, but for me it was useful, particularly because this were a particular type of letters which were now are in conversation with the state, which kind of had a particular gesture or presence in the archive. Prior to 1967, for instance, we do have security information reports which discusses Eritrea and Asmara particularly as a security situation, like as a heightened security situation from the vantage point of administering population or administering a certain descent. So that archival rule were kind of being introduced with a new type of letters, new voices, which were now recognized as a violent moment and a missing husband and a missing father, and now asking the state to kind of negotiate about particularly property. And the missing husbands and fathers are sometimes imprisoned or executed or even fled that place. And now those women, which I have found within the archive, we are now negotiating with the state, having the language of the state, which we can discuss a little later, but now having a new narrative of their husbands, which in the archives, most of the reports mention this man as anti-revolutionary, which is very much collectivized names, whereas most of these women addresses their husbands and produce private letters, marriage certificates, and other legal documents of properties, particularly vehicles and the like, to kind of negotiate with the state to say that I have this amount of children and my husband, who is so and so, is either is missing or is imprisoned. I don't have any other means to raise my children, and thus I of the women who were now. But this is now again, as I said earlier, with retrospective account of what happened in 1967. So in 1967, my husband. So when they were reconstructing the history of their letters, litigations, they kind of started from the 1967 moment where their husbands are either executed or imprisoned or missing, and the state had taken them as prisoners or executed them or are fleeing, but they kind of appropriated their legislatively appropriated their property, and thus the women came as subjects of that moment to retrospectively take the state back to its moment of administrating violence during 1967, and now entering a new deliberative moment to kind of recapture an appropriated property. And then it's this gesture, historical gesture, that I found interest in to extend to what Surrey was implying, where which is also stated in the abstract, whereby an extension of such genres of writing, which I'm now lightly calling it as retrospective accounts of the past, seems to emerge following this women, which came later in recounting 1974 Ethiopian revolution, or around that time of upheavals. We do see a trend, an emerging trend, which existed also within these letters, as I said, but also extends from them and later, to which kind of sees loss and absence and accounts for it in divergent ways. So these women, we could take them lightly as precursors, but also as a simultaneous sources which we can mobilize to account for retrospective accounts. But later on, we also see different genres emerging in similar fashion. We do have memoirs, for instance, by Hewett Tarrefe, and other memoirs, novels like by Konjit Burhan and Ma'aza Mengiste, and films like Deluge, film and documentary like that of Deluge. And we do have academic accounts or primary sources like the oral accounts, transcribed oral accounts of the Ethiopian student movement, which was deliberated collectively but transcribed and placed in IAS by Professor Baharu Zaude, which we also have a section on gender reminiscing at that point, whereby how women account for their political involvement during the student movement. In so doing, they also revisit a certain moment, the 1974 revolution and its antecedent moment as their moment of politicization and their kind of distance or closeness to that moment. And we do have an extension of that. We do have academic accounts of which takes 1974 and later very seriously, like the works of Elizabeth Waldegirgis, also Alan Desta and Eleni Santim, which again I see them as like lightly connected genres of women writings, which accounts for retrospective gesture to account for loss, just like those women which I have mentioned that have been transpired from 67. So why I take all of this together is just how do you say it? A curiosity of all of. There is no essential truth that comes from being women, but there is also a truth that comes from collectively or individually reminiscing a certain moment and accounting for it as a site of loss or a site of absence, and then engaging with it through writing. With the prior women, we do have litigation. Some of them must have been writing it themselves, or I don't have a direct account, but maybe I just imagined that some of them have used other people to write those litigations. But in fact, they kind of presented their case in writing within the archive. We do have that evidence, which have a narrative of absence of their fathers or husbands and engage with the state with that which they say is absent. And with this later genres, which I have mentioned earlier, for instance, if we take Ma'aza Mengiste, in her novel Beneath the Lion's Gaze, she gives an account of 1974 revolution and says, and poses a question which I think follows it. She follows it with her later novel, which is about a different epoch, but in 1970, in Beneath the Lion's Gaze, I think she has an argument which says, where are the women in the revolution? So the novel kind of poses that question. And Konjat Birhan may not pose that question, but brings out the different types of women who are engaging with the time of change by accounting as them as characters. He was of accounting for absence of their partners, but also their own political involvement of the time, retrospectively through memoir, writing, and autobiographies. And Deluge is a very unique work, which is a documentary which gives us, like I was saying, the method of reading sources simultaneously. We do have visual art in there, we do have interviews, we do have different film footages, and also an account of an absent brother and a friend who was a woman, and then reconstructing their narratives in relationship to that time. So she enters through documentary into this genre in accounting, in making sense of that time retrospectively using this genre. And we do have also similar, like I was saying, the oral transcription note on gender question, which was done by Professor Baharu as a primary source for his later book, The Socialist Ethiopia. We have in that account, in the gender section, we do have women deliberating during that moment, both men and women actually, talking about the absence of history of women, pertinent to the reconstruction of the history of the Ethiopian Revolution 1974, but also the different social forces who were involved during this time. And so these are what I call retrospective opening is, one, it intervenes to negotiate or to act like the litigations, which I have mentioned earlier on, to act as political actors and to negotiate and gain whatever they are able to gain. And with those litigations, for instance, those letters that I have said, in 10 years' time, we do see a change in policy of the Derg, to share a certain part of the property back to the family. So one could actually read as a cumulative retrospective engagement with 1967. We do have that sort of intervention through those letters. And with these other genres, we also have a particular way of engaging with the past, which is locating a critic and raising a question. Locating a critic in saying that a certain historical subject is lost or not reconstructed as much as the other. And two, it's to also, how do you say, kind of narrow the missing link through memoir production, self-reminiscing, and retrospective account of their own involvement in that movement. These are what I call the necessity to read sources simultaneously, oral, archival, memoirs, novels, and other genres together as retrospective deliberations and see what transpires from all of the sources. But we can discuss a little bit more about how I did this with pertinent to 1967 while I was reading the litigation letters by women who emerged in the archive, particularly during that moment. I did read them with the student paper, with nurses' voices of that time, with an archive, with novels, and also academic deliberation, which is a similar type of methodological positioning that I am now mobilizing for another type of research, which takes account a whole different. I mean, it doesn't necessarily take Azmir as a point of departure, but it takes retrospective accounts of this writings and engagements, one as a political act, two as a historical reconstructive act, and three as a necessary account in dealing with retrospection. Retrospective accounts. So I think I'll stop here and explain further if there are interests during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Nancy. You have almost finished, on time. Thank you so very much. Even though your video was, scrambling in between, I think you have given us so much to think through, to think with, and it has already, provoked some people. And Professor Fikru Nagash Gabra Kidan already wrote in the box that, I think 1967 equals 1974, and Elsie, Elizabeth Oldegurgis answered that, yes, Fikru. So I think we are going to have, hot kind of debate, discussion, conversation. So thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and the kind of, ideas and methods, theories, and the ways in which we see archives, lived experiences. That was amazing. Thank you so much. So with this, I would like to move on to the next presenter, and I would like to introduce Dr. Jonas Ashene. Jonas Ashene is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the College of Social Sciences, where he is also an associate dean of the undergraduate program. Jonas did his undergrad and MA studies at Addis Ababa University in the same department, and then he earned his PhD from Makerere Institute of Social Research in Social Studies, as Netzanet did, and currently he's teaching at the Department of Political Science and International Relations. He is working on his book project tentatively titled Slaves of State, Intellectuals of Development, a Genealogy of Developmentalism in Ethiopia. In his inquiry into the genealogy of developmentalism in Ethiopia, Jonas uses chronicles, religious books, newspapers, memoirs, and other archival materials. And in this genealogical probing, he attempts to understand what conditions of continuities, discontinuities, and contingencies inform the ways in which various vocabularies of developmentalism have been historically deployed. The wider academic projects that Jonas has been engaged with range from intellectual history, change and continuities, of the notions of sra'at, order, limat, development, zimmana, modernization, silitane, civilization, and now with the ascent of Abiy Ahmed to premiership, the idea of biltsaganna or prosperity. Jonas' talk today is titled Concepts in Moments of Political Openings in Ethiopia, a genealogical reading of progress from biltsaganna, prosperity, to silitane or civilization. His presentation focuses on the emergence of biltsaganna or prosperity as one sudden conceptual shift in the recent political openings in the country, coupled with examination of the rhetorical power of the term biltsaganna in heralding a new historical episode in Ethiopia. Jonas's two-pronged analysis looks at the conditions in which the notion of prosperity came about and the ways in which other similar vernacular concepts like silitane, zimmana, edgat, limat, biltsaganna transpired across time and space. Jonas comparatively analyzes these local global epistemologies of development to see how they bear on the present. That said, I would like to invite Dr. Jonas Ashene, Yoni, as his friends called him. Yoni, please, the floor is yours. You can open.
Thank you, Sure.
Yes.
Thank you, Sure, for for a generous introduction. And I don't know whether I am thinking in this line or not. I mean, it is too sophisticated the way you present my inquiry.
Sorry for misrepresenting you. Okay.
No, you didn't misrepresent. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, all the organizers, friends, colleagues from all over the world, and Ethiopianists who think about Ethiopia from different historical and political spaces. So in this, for this conference, for this seminar, I have been writing a paper on concepts in moments of political openings in Ethiopia, a genealogical reading of progress from biltsaganna or to civilization, or from biltsaganna to back to silitane. So my inquiry is a little bit similar with my friend Netzanet, a kind of retrospective reading, but mine is a kind of reading, doing history of the present, taking concepts seriously. My paper raises questions about Ethiopian state developmentalism in the broader landscape of Ethiopian project of modernity. I mean, not to say modernization. It builds up on my preoccupation on states and political subjects, the making of states, the unmaking of states, the making of political subjectivity, making of agents or subjects as a thinking subject, acting subjects in Ethiopia and from Ethiopia. So the paper makes use of my book project, which Raphael was mentioning about slaves of state, which tries to see the states and the slaves in the long durée and connect it with intellectuals and subjects of development in the modern period. So my book, hopefully you will see it soon, it connects the pre-modern and modern Ethiopian's political history. It's an attempt to connect the two, because most of Ethiopianists who think about Ethiopian politics today, they count the Ethiopian politics state-society relation only from the 19th century. So my reading is to see the pre-modern from the modern period, which if I am successful. So in my dissertation, I used the pre-modern archives, mainly chronicles, and some selected religious books, and also modern archives, newspapers, which Raphael mentioned it. So my mode of inquiry ranges from history, ethnography, political ethnography, genealogy, and so on. In my method, always I try to do history and I do also ethnography. I combine genealogy of concept and discourse and discursive tradition, but I always transcend the boundary between disciplines. Even though I am working in the political science department, I take seriously ethnography, I take seriously history, and especially the long history in the long durée. I try always to get the question right and try to answer using different methods and methodology in social studies, rather than dogmatically stick to one methodology and mode of inquiry. So as you know, Ethiopian political history and the project of modernity have produced numerous historical episodes. I mean, if you want to see the long duration, there are many ruptures, many contingencies, discontinuities, and continuities. And most of these, you can study them, you can take the chunk of history and study and you leave it. Or you can study continuity and connection and disconnection between different historical periods. So what I am doing and what I am always doing is this. I take seriously these sudden conceptual shifts as an entry point in my book, in my study. For example, I selectively study how Sra'at and the making of modern state started or evolved in Ethiopia in the 19th century, how Sultan emerged and evolved in the 20th century, how Limat continued from the 19th century up to the present, and how, for example, Limat and Edgat emerged in the revolutionary period and the development during the developmental stage, how Limat became the ubiquitous term and what it gives us. So I speak from the conceptual genre and grammar and language about politics and state-society relation in Ethiopia. So this project, this paper that I'm presenting is also is a continuation of this my academic intellectual inquiry. I take as we witnessed recently, there is a kind of conceptual shift, emergence of a new concept, a new political term, a new articulation in the contemporary Ethiopian political transition and opening. So what I'm doing is by grounding in my on the present political transition and the political opening in Ethiopia, and also its local, regional, global conditions, I try to explore the emergence of this term called Biltsigna, or which in English called prosperity, as a new political concept, as a new discourse or language of power or a mode of rule. I inquire Biltsigna's conditions of local and global possibility or impossibility, and its rhetorical power or heralding or also ending of a certain period in Ethiopian political history. So I take seriously this beginning of this episode because these periods are important. It really warrants our critical analysis because they come and they go usually. These times of opening up, this type of the mass repoliticizing itself, the elites opening its the boundaries, discussion really comes and go always. Which political scientists call it transition or towards democracy. They come and they go. And so I take seriously this period, still using the concept of Biltsigna, but I speak also from my advantage of reading the archive of the Ethiopian history in the long duration. So my study dwells on two analytical exploration. First, it conducts an ethnographic contextual study of the emergence of Biltsigna as a key political concept and explores its discursive meaning, focusing on the political and by genealogically reading of the emergence of this term, similar with Limat and Sultani or developmental civilization in the early 20th century, Limat and Zemana or developmental modernization in the liberation period, Limat and Edgar in the revolution period. I try to read this comparatively, explore how relevant, and what it does to us, what it does to the Ethiopian politics, whether it heralds a new politics or it doesn't tell us anything new, whether it forms as a new possibility, a new impossibility, whether there is a rupture and discontinuities and continuities. So I try to use documents, recent development plans, political economic plannings, ruling party documents, which are very rare to get, leaders' speech, which are everywhere, and also PowerPoint-based documents which are coming from the PMO office and from the Minister of Finance and etc. So I try to make sense the emergence of the concept of Biltsigna as a new political term, a language of rule and a discourse of power. So in the paper, I argue that the emergence of Biltsigna as a discourse of power appears similar with the emergence of other concepts, such as Rad in the 19th century, Ergat and Limat in the 20th century, but strikingly different from Sultani, which had undergone a kind of different intellectual thought exercise in the early 20th century, starting from early 20th century. as you know, the modern Ethiopian state is associated with the concept of Srat, to mean order, discipline, or a kind of sense of bureaucratic order. Limat was invoked together with Srat to signify progress in general, what I call a bureaucratic order. So most of these terms informs us political economic transformation. They promise political economic transformation in Ethiopia. In the first half of 20th century, there was also, a term Seletani, which means civilization, development, modernization, with a very different nuanced meaning. Seletani was a product of intellectual invention, a new concept from older one. So a kind of thought, thinking subjects, you can see thinking subjects trying to invent a new concept to articulate what's happening in Ethiopia, what was promised in Ethiopia starting from early 20th century. And most of the conceptual history in Ethiopia was written about Seletani. And no other term has been studied similar to Seletani in Ethiopian political history. So it is an exceptional term in invented concept used to articulate state developmentalism in Ethiopia. But when we come to Biltzigna, Biltzigna is very similar with Limat and Irget, which were mobilized mainly in the revolutionary period and its aftermath. Both Limat and Irget were widely used in social concepts, selected and deployed during the state to articulate state developmentalism. Limat as a term is an exceptional term because it has been there, it refused to disappear. Even if other auxiliary terms, other core terms coming and going, Limat was starting from the Tedros Chronicle up to the present speeches of the Prime Minister, Limat remained constant. But other terms come, sometimes they dominate Limat as an articulation of state developmentalism, and other times they simultaneously use Limat and other terms such as Seletani, Srat. So Limat remain constant. It means development, but it has a different genealogical meanings. It has different nuanced meaning in different historical contexts. So in the post-1990 period, Limat becomes the most popular, ubiquitous concept. It's an adjective, a noun. It defines every political and social and state-society relation in the recent past. And the post-1990 period, it becomes a term signifying development or Limatawi Mangist, so state developmental states. Now, this term has been disappearing, or reducing its availability, its present as a political concept, and we see kind of conceptual rhetorical shift from Limat to prosperity or Biltzigna. So Biltzigna is becoming the most used term. It is very unfortunate when the state or the political elites used concepts, they become also social, they get their own social life in a very everyday life of society. So many people articulate the political economic planning today as a Biltzigna or as a road toward this prosperity, especially if you read the homegrown economic plan, even if it uses development, but it is considered as a blueprint toward this prosperity. So prosperity is not a new term. It is not like Seletani. It is like Limat, Irget, which were used in the social or in a religious or in a different purpose. Now it become a key political term. It is deployed as a political term by the ruling party, the prime minister. It is born out of the EPRDF's contested process of self-recreation. Biltzigna is not a term which comes out of the blue, out from the sky. It is born out of the EPRDF's belly, from its own contestation. It is from its own attempt to recreate itself. It is part of the new language and the grammar to articulate what is happening in the political transition in the contemporary Ethiopia. It is also this political transition, as you know, is a product, of popular protests which stayed in Ethiopia for a long period of time, and also from the above, the party competition, the party internal crisis. The popular protesters has had anti-state capitalism essence. I have to quote a lady which is attending this seminar, her book, Ethiopian Theory. She really articulates this moment of anti-state capitalism protest and how the transition period has been, promising and what kind of politics is coming. Her book is the earliest articulation of what is going on in the transition period, which is ethno-nationalism, administrative nationalism, erupted here and there, and the political protest, and the popular protest itself becomes a challenge to the ongoing political transition. Elite polarization, elite difference, and the disagreement also engulfed the transition process. EPRDF itself becomes the victim of its own recreation, and we see the split of the ruling party EPRDF into TPLF, the mother party of the coalition EPRDF, now a newly reformed political party, Prosperity Party, separated from the TPLF. So this contestation between Prosperity Party and TPLF, the original scene, crisis within the Ethiopian transition. This is just the context, the political context in which the Biltzigana as a concept seemingly emerged from an attempt to create this departure from EPRDF limits. The concept emerged as a result of the deep renewal project of EPRDF itself, which ended in the crisis of the party itself. So the process, the present moment, whether we call it a continuation of the revolution or a progressive politics, or we call it a counter-revolutionary period or reactionary period, it is a product of EPRDF itself. It is a product of EPRDF internal political process. EPRDF as a ruling party recreated the possibility for a political episode which is heralded through the concept of Biltzigana and its politics. So it is not a different opposition party coming and taking power from EPRDF. So EPRDF is the mother of this political party called Prosperity Party. So what the concept informs us is, I have to say something about its etymological meaning briefly. Biltzigana etymologically, the meaning is related to wealth, dictionary meanings, different Amharic dictionary meaning related to wealth. It also connotes gift, fortune, education, even it means forgiveness, dignity, and charisma. Unlike many concepts used in Ethiopia, it does not inform process or journey or progress. It is about ownership or being able to receive or give something which is worth, that's wealth. All other terms such as Littani, Limat, Idgat inform us about linear process which articulated in English as progress, civilization, and development. But Biltzigana is exceptional. It is a noun. It is synonymous with wealth. The concept has been a social and also liturgical concept in Ethiopia. Ubiquitous used literature in different forms such as Tsagga, Baletsagga, and so on. Many associate the concept mainly in English, in the English term prosperity, with a particular forms of Pentecostalism in the US, which is called prosperity gospel. However, Ethiopian Pentecostalism has been a site of similar thought for the last 2 or 3 decades. The prosperity church and the various sects from Pentecostal churches mobilized such powerful discourse in Ethiopia in the post-1919 Ethiopian period. Pentecostalism, similar to any other movements, is also connected to the global trend, so there might be global connection, but we have to take the local political, religious, social movements when we write the history of emergence of concepts such as Biltzigana. So there is a more visible terms than the performative power of the faith that uses, among others, speaking of tongues, prophecy, healings, exorcism as a tool to transform both individual and society. It is worth to mention the famous book entitled Kafata Zaman Ethiopia, an era of climax or apex to Ethiopia. It was written by a priest from the Protestant church named Bellina Sarka. This book was published in 2000, and the book describes the bright future yet to come in Ethiopia. And this book was emerged during the developmental state project. And it depicts more in capitalist, materialist, developmental, inclusive of infrastructural transformation, such as railway, booming of trade in the Horn of Africa. So it is simultaneous with the developmental states project. We see religious prophecy as a political, articulation of what is the arrival of the, the heaven on earth and so on. What is at stake here is how such conceptual imagination informs us with the creative reading and storytelling act of political subject. So we don't have to, just connect with a US-based, gospel or Pentecostalism, but I take seriously what is happening in the local, why people are taking seriously such anticipation, such political religiosity connection in the articulation of prosperity or development or transformation in Ethiopia. So it should be noted that the discursive tradition, which I call borrowing from Talal Assad, is not a mere use of biblical texts or grammar for political Ethiopia, but it is linked with the political subjectivity that imagined a radical departure from the political present. It is a status quo anti-expectation, formulation, a call for change, articulation, and an imagination of often accompanied by a subversive and expletive political action. When we talk about religiosity or terms which are borrowed from religious movements, we don't have to simply ridicule them by calling them as a religious terms coming to the palace and so on. If you read seriously terms and prophecy texts in Ethiopian political history, they come from the religious movements, but they inform us the subjectivity and the imagination of the subject towards a new political horizon. I hope and I think Pentecostalism has to be taken seriously in its own imagination of the new political beginning in Ethiopia, as we used to take Orthodox church texts and their prophecies seriously, especially during the emergence of the modern state itself is a product of prophecy, as we know, as all of us we know. But this is Biltsigana's etymological meaning connection with religiosity and so on, or prosperity in general in the global condition. But what it does to us, Biltsigana as a concept, what it does to the Ethiopian political economy and politics, I have to say briefly something. What the official concept of Biltsigana promises and what it does within the Ethiopian politics yet to be explored. Perhaps the dust has to settle to confidently talk about what it does to what it's going to do something about Ethiopian politics. However, close observation of the rhetoric of the state and the prime minister, listening to the speech of the leaders, mainly the prime minister, and reading of political economic plannings or documents, which are most of them in the PowerPoint forms, all inform us as continuity of the Ethiopian state developmentalism. If one closely reads the history of, for example, Shaggar Riverside project, or this beautification of Addis and so on, the political and its political economic dynamics informs us continuity, but painted with a conceptual and rhetorical departure. The ascendancy of the concept of Biltsigana or prosperity informs the continuity of the Ethiopian economic nationalism. This is a form of nationalism that writes the history of state developmentalism that hitherto defined the masses as object of development. The major feature of the state developmentalism in the past and in the contemporary period are the following. One, centralized planning. Two, elite-initiated mega projects in the urban areas, in the rural areas. Nationalism from the above, but followed and recruit and preach the mass to follow. Personality cult associated with the prime minister office, which was in the past and now, especially now, more visible. Call of unity as a means of prosperity in a very fragmented, divided society. Regional unity for prosperity, especially now, the Horn of Africa, the call for regional unity in the Horn of Africa become everyday language of the prime minister office, and the new Ethiopian foreign policy also underlines this call for unity, regional integration for prosperity or for Biltsigana. Invitation of the private actor to be a junior partner in bringing prosperity or Biltsigana, but above all, the masses in this rhetoric, in this discourse, in this language of rule, the masses are object of state developmentalism. So Biltsigana is not an exceptional, is not a rupture in terms of political economic language. It is a rupture conceptually, yes. It's a rupture, it's discontinuity. It is a new episode in terms of language, concepts, rhetoric, but in terms of its power, in terms of its what it informs, what it does to politics is a continuity rather than a rupture. if it is any rupture, it's any discontinuity, if it's something new in Ethiopia, which Biltzigna brings, is Biltzigna can be considered as rebranding of the developmental state or state developmentalism. What has been done under the concept of Biltzigna is an attempt to rebrand the developmental state project, paint or transcend the crisis with the developmental state of Ethiopia. It promises to correct the democratic deficit, the human rights violation, the depoliticization, and the corruption. Above all, it envisioned to correct the economic nationalism without Ethiopian nationalism, regionalism without economic integration road of EPRD. EPRDF economic nationalism was implemented without, serious Ethiopian nationalism. Its regional integration project regionalism was without project of regional integration. But this prosperity-led or prosperity as a rebrand of the developmental state attempts to democratize in a certain way. If it continue like that, the developmental state project following the voice of the mass or forced by the voice of the mass, the result of the mass protest, it tries to, or it's impossible to depoliticize the mass at the moment.
Yoni, Jonas, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because you have used, more minutes. So can you wrap it up like in a minute?
1 minute, just 1 minute.
Thank you.
So Biltzigna, with its seductive discursive power, used to appeal to the masses, transcending religious and secular lines. Through its mega projects, mainly now located in the urban areas such as Shega Renewal Project, it promises the arrival of the economic utopia in 2025 in Ethiopia. The concept informs us the midwifery role of the state and its journey to economic utopia called prosperity. Depoliticization of its impact is inevitable, even if it tries to talk about the democratization of the developmental state. Still, it is elite-led and it's a continuation of the developmental state project. And this rebranding of the developmental state evolved in the context of global national politics, especially the global context defined by extreme nationalism, populism, racism, right-wing extremism, and the return of the geopolitical conditions. This ramification in the Horn and also in the Ethiopian politics, especially the populism, extremism, especially ethno-nationalism, administrative nationalism, Ethiopian nationalism also ascended. So it is in the age of nationalism, the geopolitical competition, this Biltzigna tries to do politics in Ethiopia. Thank you, sorry for taking much time.
Oh, sorry, I was supposed to unmute myself, sorry. It was energetic and thank you so much. I think people have, many questions and some of them are sending to us. Please use the Q&A boxes to send us your questions. In the meantime, I can ask a couple of questions to each of you. Nezanet, can you hear me? Can you open your video, please? My first question to Nelsie is, you invoke simultaneous opening of the past and the present. This notion of simultaneous opening of the past and the present. What theoretical and methodological possibilities does this idea offer? That is, one question. And the second one is, you also use the idea of retrospective engagement in your analysis. In view of traditional history, retrospective reading is disavowed on the basis that events have to be reconstructed as they have happened. This is how traditional history has been arguing and has been writing history. On the other hand, thinkers like Teshome Habte Gabriel posits that one aspect of memory, which, for instance, Teshome Habte Gabriel calls retrospective or recollective memory, which can be recalled and narrativized, while involuntary and spontaneous memory cannot be recalled at will and cannot be narrativized. We have also, idea of counter memories and other ideas around memory studies. So in view of such contestations around the notion of retrospective or the category of the retrospective, what are you trying to do with this term, retrospective engagement?
Okay, thank you, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, So the first question is like, what is the possibilities, what conceptual possibilities and sort of methodologically, I don't know, benefits we can gain from this, I mean, engaging with sources from the present time about the past, but also from along with sources which are of the past and has come to us at a particular time, at least to our utilization. I have gone very utilitarian tonight. Very odd terms coming to me. Okay, so I think that's a very interesting question. Thank you for the question, Suri. How I could engage with your question is by going back to how the sources I have used, both from the present, like the oral aspect of reminiscing, like the retrospective reminiscing writings of self-writing, novels which are written at a certain point, has offered a certain way of looking at sources themselves. I mean, taking the historical emergence of each sources. So just to give you a brief description of how I'm looking at this, for instance, there is a perception, at least I used to have a perception of the archival material to be of a different, I mean, for instance, the 1967, even the prior to that, archives are kind of readily available since the 1967. But I mean, if you investigate the history of those sources, we do have different narratives around those sources. And my investigation is particularly because I'm interested in memory and memory formation. I would also be interested about the lives of those sources, right? The history of those sources. So for instance, if you see the Nala archive, the archival materials that are available to us today, at least that were available to me in 2015, as I was doing this research, were kind of simultaneously, if you take Addis Ababa as a site of historical research, particularly through my entry point, you would find during that time, archives of the Nala has opened about this particular time, for instance, in 2013. That's when the National Archive was making available, at least for the wider public, the archives that of the specific name. We do have specific categorizations of those archives. ለምሳሌ የሀገር ግዛት archives. Those specific የግቢ ሚኒስቴር, which kind of compiled the Eritrean sections of the archival material, which I have now digged into to look into how the 1967 was being represented in that moment, actually opened up 2013. So there was a history of that archive itself and its moment of emerging into a public space, right? So whoever was able to write, for instance, if I was able to do this research prior to 2013, perhaps there were few of these papers that I could access from other archival sites. So taking this into consideration then would help us to look into how past is the past, right? How further is the past? Like, although I'm investigating later archival materials of 1967, those were available to me in 2015, and their history was that 2013 was the cutoff point for them to emerge in the public arena to be used as sites sources for historical reconstruction. And we do have historians struggling meaning kind of advocating for those sources to open up. All of that needs to be accounted for to also look into particularly the memories aspect of a certain historical reconstructions. What makes historical reconstructions or new interpretations possible is the ways in which those sources are produced. One, using their own timeline, right? Two, also the way they are politically produced. This is to say that we do have legislation that kind of legislates kind of put 5% of the public, 5% of the archives are the ones which are to be represented in the National Archive. So all of this produces a certain archive, but so it's not neutral, right? So it's not to take the value of that archive, but to account for the history of that production of the archive is very central into taking those accounting of the history of that archive into, then to come back to your question, then past to this archives were no one 1967, but it's also 2013, but it's also 2015 because I mean where I entered into that archive is 2015. So it's this multiplicity of time that it offers, for instance, as to consider it as I account for memory, but not only about the life of the archive, but the life of the oral narrative also is of 2015. So the political, historical, social condition of 2015, for instance, is that it's prior to 2018. So that's it's the formulation of neither war nor peace moment. That's the moment through which people were reminiscing, right? So taking that into account substantively, as historians, I mean, I'm not a historian. At least I shy away from saying stating myself as a historian, but I do use a historical method of those which are available to me through particularly the methods of African history. So that method which I have borrowed from is to acknowledge the political aspect of those sources and their temporal emergence and their substantive significance of their arrival at a particular time. So that's for the order, right? So 2015 makes it possible for people to deliberate about the history of the 1960s and earlier times of a city which is Asmara through a very substantive account of reminiscing, but also engaging with the present. So opening up the present and the past is almost inevitable during such contexts. And I think it's very much relevant for historians to consider, and I'm not the one to start it, to consider not only the historical sources which of these types, but also to consider like the autobiographical accounts, poems, novels, musics, which are being produced during the similar times as deliberations of that which is absent, right? So absent through different ways. So one intervention through the researcher is like producing interviews about a certain moment and a site which is not of politically accessible at that point. Also, to an extent, the corroborations of materials, historical materials from the Asmara side and Ethiopian side are not possible. So acknowledging that and accounting for it is very central in such times at least, but I think it's also useful in different times. So attaching to your second question, so I think it's very obvious how maybe I've answered the—
Sorry, Nancy.
Yes,
Nancy.
sorry.
Yes. Sorry, I really appreciated the ways in which you engaged with the question. So if we can be brief, then we can allow many participants to ask. Already many people are raising their hands. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, apologies. So I think that's it. Maybe I'll come back to your question, which is about the
retrospective engagement.
Okay. I think I can briefly say that the school of thought that I engaged with is Ngugi, for instance. Like particularly, I mobilized him seriously in this work when he discusses about the rupture continuity engagement between African diaspora history and African history through multiplicities of sources. So you could see also the multiplicities of sources. I have gotten that invitation from him through the relevance of retrospection, not only to account for historical presence, but also for their absence. So it's that which retrospective opening offers. Also in this women's writing and litigation, you could see new actors coming into the story, new voices being acknowledged. And all of this is possible if you take retrospective engagement seriously, but also very critically. And that's where also I take seriously those which says retrospective should be taken with portions, right? So that's the critical aspect is very central as well, whereby you would not take every retrospection seriously, but the act of retrospection needs to be taken seriously because it offers a lot in producing multiple voices, actors, and also interventions. It's a sort of a gestural intervention into taking stake in the past and tied to the present, but through different means. Sorry, I took so much time.
No. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I can move on to my question, but I would like to ask, instead of asking two questions, I only ask Yoni just one question. Yoni, can you hear me? Jonas, can you hear me? Would you please open your mic?
Yes.
Thank you, and your video too. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, yes. So my question is, in the idea of Maddamer, and which is also, related with the idea of Bilsagana, because the Maddamer seems to be an overarching kind of category that has been deployed by the state, in contemporary politics. So this new concept of change in Ethiopia propagated by the Prime Minister gives primacy to the idea of democracy as a pending question next to the land and nationality questions articulated in the 1974 revolution. And as you well know, it's Jonas, there is this apolitical kind of narratives which entirely disavows the legacy of the leftist politics, particularly in relation to the economic question, is so disquieting. And so how can you account for these discontinuities in a way which are really coming in a very glaring fashion? And how can we account for, as much as you were telling us that there is really continuity that we need to attend to within this state apparatus that has been inherited from the past. But at the same time, how can we account for these kinds of, in the age of neoliberalism, and erasing the historical relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor? In Maddamer, no one does not want to raise about this, hierarchical historical relationship. Please reflect on that, and I can invite more people. I would appreciate it if you can be brief, even though I was not brief while asking this question.
Thank you, sorry. In this paper, I only focus on the concept of Bilsagana. But Maddamer as a strategy can be also related to this term called Bilsagana. I think Maddamer is one aspect which I call an attempt to rebrand Ethiopian economic nationalism by bringing the Ethiopian nationalism seriously, Maddamer is an attempt to read harmony, social harmony in Ethiopian political context. As you also mentioned, the leftist politics read contradiction and class politics into the Ethiopian body politics. But this one is, so that's why I call the rebranding attempt is by rereading harmony or promising harmony and nationalism at the macro level, as a national level, and so also harmony at the regional and the Horn of Africa. It tries to rebrand the developmental state. It is not about its democracy. What Maddamer calls is this harmony, envisioning social harmony, which is the result of social interaction. So it is a complete opposite to the Marxist or class based analysis, which sees contradiction as a mother of every historical revolution, as a mother of history and so on, as the engine of history and so on. Here, this one reads Maddamer, integration, synergy as a mother of Ethiopian history. To what extent this is historical or not is not the question. But what it does to the Ethiopian politics which is important, because even if it talks about many things in its etymological, philosophical meaning, what is important is what it does practically. So can we say is the Indo-class conflict in Ethiopia? Are we seeing the end of the ethnic polarization in Ethiopia? So this emerged to minimize this polarized ethno-nationalism and also, but also class, the language of class has been silent for a long period of time in Ethiopia, even within the EPRDF period. That's why we have the horizontal ethnic tensions are erupting here and there because of the absence of class language, I think.
Thank you so much. So now I can invite, there are people who have already raised their hands. So I would like to invite Fuad. You can come forward. You can open your mic and video and you can ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Raphael. There were other questions before me, but I'll try to be very brief about this. First, the question is for Ms. Annette. I really appreciate the idea that one needs to look at events from different vantage points, voices, sources, temporalities, and etc. But what actually emerges from doing that in terms of our understanding of January 1975 in Asmara, right? It'd be nice to hear what has actually emerged in your understanding of that event itself. And to Jonas, my question is really about, well, again, I really much appreciated your presentation and liked your emphasis on thinking about Bilsagina or prosperity in local terms. But it's rather 2-year period, a rather brief period, so big conclusions about it. But if you situate it comparatively, there is something one could say, and this could be different in the Ethiopian case, we don't know. But there are signs that suggest it's quite similar to discourses that come out of evangelically driven movements, political movements elsewhere, Brazil, different parts of Latin America, where this is quite strong, that suggests it has some kind of elective affinity to neoliberal policies. So I'd like to hear what you say about that, especially given what Surafel had to say about the kind of what this discourse elides, right? Which I kind of find that quite interesting. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yoni, do you want me to also add other questions? Then you can stop them together?
Yes.
Or? Okay, good. Elsie, can you come and ask Yoni? I heard that you have a question.
Okay, now a minute. Sorry.
Please, I really appreciate it if you can be very brief.
Yes, no, related to Fuad's question for Nationalism, for example. I'm very intimate with both dissertations. So, I mean, fascinating dissertations, both of them. So, but I want Nationalism to talk about specific things, how like administrative, I know you used administrative archives, which was very interesting, how you approach the administrative archive. And if you can just give us an anecdote of 1975 in the administrative archive. For example, in the Nurses Association archive, and the question of land and women that you raised and that, right? So if you can talk about specific things like that, it would be helpful for other, how it evolved, how historicizing that evolved in the 1975 event. That's one for you. For Yoni, because you talk about Shirat, I think you go back, I don't know if you still do in the book, but you go back to 13th century Shirat and how it evolved to civilization, the genealogy of Shirat to civilization. So what is Shirat and what is that? Briefly, if you can take us through that genealogy to Hilitani particularly, not modernization or anything, what Hilitani, specifically to Hilitani, and how you interpret Shirat, I mean, how you tie up those two, Shirat and civilization together. But it'll be helpful for people to find out how you historicize these things through the archive. You've engaged a lot of archives. So one is that for Yoni, and for Najanat, it's the administrative archive that's really interesting. So if you can give us an anecdote of that too.
Okay, let's attempt these questions, and I will invite Shumelis Bonsa.
May I, Sorey?
Please, Jonas, and then Nancy. Yes. Okay.
Nancy, would you or? Okay, let me start.
You have already taken the mic. Go on.
Okay.
Go ahead, Yoni, as usual.
So there are three questions. One, the transnational linkages, which Fuad has raised. Yes, in my genealogy of terms or genealogical study, I do not disregard or I do not consider Ethiopia as an exceptional local space. I don't create a kind of ghetto history when I do genealogy. I always try to connect what has happening in Ethiopia in connection with the global contours and landscape and dynamics of politics. For example, when I connect Srat, for example, during the if you read Tedros' speech, Tedros' letters, you read a lot of terms such as Srat. But Srat is a liturgical concept borrowed from the church, from different documents. You know, it's very difficult to separate church and state. But in terms of religiosity, which produce the Tedros' subjectivity, I read seriously Fukara Jesus as a prophecy. Tedros is not only a product of the Balkan War. Tedros is not a product of the 19th century encounter with Europe. But Tedros was a product of Fukara Jesus document, which evolved, reproduced from 12th, 13th century. Starting from that moment, we see this literature is parallel with the Kabra Negast itself. So I read the starting of the modern Ethiopian state from Fukara Jesus, not from the Kabra Negast. So modern state is the replacement of, in terms of imagination, the replacement of Kabra Negast by Fukara Jesus. So Fukara Jesus is a religious text, but it influences the political process of imagining a new modern renewal, the coming of the new king, a new harmony and a new wills and so on. So I connect this Sarat with Seltane in a new imagination in the 20th century by taking seriously local literature, Amharic thinkers, writers in the Brahane Salam and other memoirs written in the period. So connect with Limat, Edget, and now I am trying to think and add to that scholarship the concept of Beltsagan, how it is emerged. Yes, right, it is 2 years. It is, I said the dust has not yet settled. But from the documents coming from from transitional politics that we are inhabiting today, we see much of continuities and a departure in terms of political economy. You know, the Ethiopian economic nationalism has not been that much challenged, similar to what you mentioned in Brazil and elsewhere, which prosperity has been used as a language of liberal rhetoric. Yes, in the beginning of the transition period, we were afraid, we were insecure, we were listening to the neoliberal rhetoric from the Prime Minister's speech. But as we see, as we follow, you know, closely, if you observe the new policies, for example, the rebranding of the state-owned enterprises, the re-strengthening of the state-owned enterprises, the investment of the state in urban and rural projects, this shows us the continuity of the state's developmentalism in Ethiopia, but its impact of depoliticizing the mass is also continuing with itself. So there is a liberal aspect of, liberalizing the political space, opening up the political space. But in terms of the discourse of development, Belsigana informs us continuities and departure. I think somebody was saying this is a very simplistic. Somebody from Europe always, they see the complexity from abroad, but I see the simplicity of Belsigana. My misrepresentation was written in the question and answer place or platform. But what I am seeing is this is 2 years, very preliminary findings. But what I see from the speech and the documents is much of continuities and departure, and it ensure historical, the Prime Minister and the language and his subjectivity itself emerged out of EPRDF's space. It is not coming out from other political spaces or political parties. So I am not disregarding the intellectual, the individual thinking subjectivity or subjects within EPRDF itself, but I have to connect who is thinking about this is still from the EPRDF. So EPRDF is transformed into prosperity party. This is not disregarding, erasing the role of the individual. Thank you, Sore.
Thank you so much. Nessie, you can come. Would you open your mic and video, please?
I think both Professors Fuad's and Elsie's questions are very related, but I would, so my interest in this particular paper was actually to account for precursors, at least from what I have studied so far, right? So I'm not claiming that there aren't other precursors, particularly in the land litigations of women in different contexts. I've heard that the similar engagements of different social actors have been in conversation or at least in contestation through that form with the state. But my interest was like more on the engagement of women, which has come from a particular type of history, which is 1967. So I'm happy that you have brought in that question, so because it would help me elaborate on what 1967 was, or at least how it became, particularly by reading different types of sources. So what I did was, like, when the oral account brought 1967 as an account of violent moment in Asmara, there is one co-recognition of both Eritrean voices and Ethiopian voices about the violent aspect of that moment. And the very political denouncing that violence. The state, people were accounting that moment as a moment of horrific experience. So there is that sort of agreement or collective recognition of the moment as a very violent moment. So one is that account. And the second account, which comes from the archival account, is the deliberations which has come through retrospective engagement in litigations, is to kind of give a different narrative of their husbands, their imprisoned husbands, their lost, those who were executed. They were not only collectively, but they were fathers and of people of a property and people of their own dignity as fathers and sort of husbands to their wives. And through entering a litigation with the state, there is a freeing aspect of that narrative of anti-revolutionary, and thus one deserves violence, but it shifts that narratives of those collective men through different litigation letters to give it a story which is a layered story of that anti-revolutionary framing, is layered by this women's letters. If you collectively read and see them, you would see them as collective of men who were probably involved in the revolution or not, but the state acted on them in the guise of anti-revolution, framing of anti-revolutionary. So in that, another layer, what we could see is the state, right, even from 1967, the way the Ethiopian state engaged with the Eritrean question was through an engagement of violence, and thus a reframing of those collective, how to say, emergence of questions through framing like anti-revolutionary. So those collective framings were used as how do you say, license of violence against those people whose wives are now kind of, under quotation, liberating the narratives by calling them as fathers whose absence needs to be taken care of by engaging the state through at least their property. So there is that sort of another narrative that comes through those letters. And another, perhaps another realization of that moment is it was anti-revolutionary for the state narrative from the perspective of the Dirk, but it was an emergence of a revolutionary era for the Eritrean question through armed struggle. So there is that. This is why we have to conjecturally read those sources, because if you read only the administrative archive of rule, one would see those anti-revolutionaries only as anti-revolutionaries. But if one reads those archives also alone against the grains through these litigations, you would also see the freeing aspect of those narratives, just as husbands and like fathers, but also perhaps an embroidering formation of the narrative of revolutions of Eritrea from those archives. So one could also write that backwards, right? So that's what I could say. For Elsie, also similar to Fuad's question, the nurses archive, how I read it is, so there is a student, there is an administrative archival account, there is an oral account, there is an account that comes from students, not only Ethiopian student movement, which is Challenge, and others which were formulating Eritrean questions. There were also other students' publication, like the Nurses publication, which I have mobilized to reading that particular moment, which were also being produced. And I thought reading them could also bring another writers, another actors, another voice, and deliberations about change, and the sort of deliberations of change that came from that particular nurses voices, Asmara nurses voices archive, was an engagement of change about professional development, about traveling for educational purposes, about self-improvement. So these were the sort of conceptions of change that were coming from those from that archive. So when I read it along with other archives, it wouldn't be only a revolt archive, it wouldn't be only an archive of rule, but it would also be an archive of aspirations, other aspirations, like I said, which were also being fermented during that time, but maybe perhaps were being eclipsed by dominant historical narratives, which took a certain categories very seriously and undermine others. And this is why the retrospective opening could enable us see, perhaps. Sorry for taking so much. Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nancy. I would like to invite next Shimelis Bonsa, and I would like to take this moment to tell all attendees to send us their questions through the Q&A section, and please type your questions there so that I can read it for the speakers. Now I invite Shimelis Bonsa to come and pose his questions.
Okay.
You can open your mic and you can open your video if you want. Yeah,
thank you, Suri, and thank you both panelists, Nazanet and Jonas, for a very impressive, very critical exploration of two very, very important stories of contemporary Ethiopia.
Thank you. Sorry, Shime, for cutting you short again. But I would like you to be very brief because, you know, we need to end it like at 10:15 UAE time. So I want you to be very brief, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No problem. Thank you, the both panelists. So the first question is for Nazanet. So I continue with on Surafil's question of what theoretical and methodological possibilities can be opened by a retrospective re-engagement with the past, or a specific past, in this case, the student movement, the Ethiopian student movement and the Ethiopian revolution. My question is how such reflexive engagements can also become oppressive, because there is a possibility of that privileging some stories and accounts at the expense of others, meaning that kind of retrospective engagement, re-engagement with the past, becoming or ending up producing hegemonic stories, which is an issue with the historiography of the Ethiopian revolutionary experience, of its biases and silences when it comes to issues like gender, for instance, and what can be done to avoid such a possibility as someone engaging with this kind of works. So that's for Nazanet. For Jonas, I think some of the questions that I sent to you, Surafil, were also raised by I think Professor Fuad. So one question is, you were talking about the sudden conceptual shifts in this conceptual shift, especially to ideas, concepts of prosperity. My question here is, how sudden is the suddenness of the conceptual shift? Do they really represent a rupture, especially because of your fascinating exploration of the lineage of these ideas throughout Ethiopian history, going back to the medieval period. And then an interesting, and speaking of political openings, new political openings, an interesting question would be to inquire how these openings and new political dispensations open up and close off new potentially liberatory avenues of political imaginations, or in composing and imposing oppressive discourses and practices. Then a question that I think Professor Fuad Maki mentioned is how these concepts like prosperity shaped or informed by global processes or tap into global discourses. I'm particularly fascinated by the neoliberal, but also evangelical conception of prosperity. A fascinating exploration in this case would be the inkar or traffic, dialogic or otherwise, between evangelical understandings of individual collective fulfillment and political consumption of prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shemelis. So we have, overlapping questions. Ali Maki also asked that I appreciate your attempts to relate modern discourses on development and modernity with the pre-modern. Don't you also need to examine simultaneously transnational influences on these ideas, be it, for example, Marxism or the evangelical movement? So, Yoni, this is for you, and Nasi, you had the question from Sheme, so the floor is yours. Now, this time, Nasi should come first. Yeah. Nasi,
okay.
Would you please
unmute
unmute yourself? Thank you. Yeah. And Sheme, unmute yourself. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Melis, for the question. And perhaps I'm not very clear with the previous deliberations, but I will try again. So interventions, or one could recover or engage with absence. Yeah, so I think one of the theoretical or and methodological offers that retrospection could give is, by their very nature so far, from my engagement with retrospection, the way I have noticed it so far, for instance, from the litigations I have mentioned, is the engagement with actually with a very dominant state archive.
Sorry. Yes, thank you so much. Jonas, can you please, Nasi, it was scrambling. I don't know why. I think it's...
You may write to Nazi. Nazi, can you hear us?
Now she can. Yeah?
Yes.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I would like to suggest if the video is overloading the internet, Nets, you could switch off the video for a while and just
yes,
choose the...
Yes. That's good. Have you heard this suggestion, Nancy? Yes, so that we can hear your voice clearly. Okay, please come again and tell us, what you have been saying, like for the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, so I think one of the conceptual offers that retrospective engagement with history has is acknowledging absence, right? So for instance, I can give a couple of examples. For instance, is from those litigation or from those letters, for instance, I have found out that their husband's absence, either through imprisonment or execution, and their appropriation of those properties were acknowledged by those women, right? And that's not only acknowledged, but as part of their acknowledgement, they were also engaging with the states at that time to kind of negotiate about a partial recovery of their property. So those retrospective accounts within the litigation, going back from the 1971, 72, 73, until 78, until that the rules change about a partial reappropriation of properties for those families, I see those women's voices and their engagement retrospectively with the event 1967 as one acknowledgement of absence, 2, giving those men a new history, 3, also giving themselves an act of political engagement with what was present at that time, and thus trying to share the property with the state, for instance. So I'm giving this descriptive analysis, but the theoretical or benefit then is one is like how absences can be acknowledged in this retrospective accounts, but also not only acknowledged, but then intervened, right? Like I said, through memoirs, through novels, through other, those academic reiterations that came from women, for instance, are saying that our historical accounts of the students' movement are not accounted as much. It was collectively narrated as a student movement, and thus our engagement, political engagement at that time, was not as much acknowledged as our male comrades. So that's what I get from, for instance, the oral recollections of the gender question during the student movement. Not only that we do see interventions of women through their memoirs and novels and other genres, but we also see giving alternative histories to the time, right? From these varied actors. For instance, like I said, even the notion of change, if you see it only from the perspective of the student movement publication, change is revolutionary, it's very leftist, and it was, we know it as the dogmatic meta-narrative of the 1974 revolution pertinent to the student movement. We know that is a kind of dominant narrative. But if you see the nurses' voices, for instance, which were students, but had a different conception of change, as I said, which I have read simultaneously, for instance, and recovers a number of women writers who are nurses, who sees their self-improvement as change on its own right, but also a conception of change of the time being deliberated from a different class or actors also can be voiced. So it recovers multiple actors, it recovers different conception of change and engagement with change, and also it doesn't make the state the solitary source of narrative. If you read the archive, the retrospective accounts of even within the archive and the different actors which are engaging within the archive. So I don't know if I'm answering this, but the methodologically also, then I'm attaching this retrospections are not only in the archives, are not only in orals, but also they are coming in genres like novels, which, like I said, Maaza Mengiste states that where are the women in the in the revolution, where are the stories of the women? That's the sort of questions she raises in the novel. And thus, you may not take the novel seriously for its narrative of the revolution, but you will take it seriously for posing this question. And thus, this is what you cannot ignore novels into accounting the epoch in this fashion, and thus methodologically then it will forces us, or at least invites us, to use a variety of sources in recovering this multiplicity of actors, which kind of could displace a unitary narrative of an epoch, particularly also from the Eritrean side. 1974 or 75 had a different temporal significance, a different engagement, a different starting point, right? So for the departure for the Ethiopian side is also a departure for the Eritrean side in a different direction, which I think the Ethiopian historiography has to take very seriously, beyond the taking the nationalistic view, but also exploring the different ways in which different sides of politics were engaging with the center at that time.
Thank you. Yoni, you can come. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. Lots of questions, and it's nice to hear from Shemalis, an old friend, Ashi. There are three questions from Shemalis. One, it is about conceptual shift. How do we know? I mean, how sudden is the suddenness of the conceptual shifts? It's a very interesting question. If you put Biltzegana in the genealogy of concepts which articulate state developmentalism in Ethiopian political history, Biltzegana is too sudden. I mean, with to replace development, Limat. I mean, we have been tired of listening, hearing Limat as a concept, as a political concept, suffocated by its and also sometimes enjoy its promises and also with what it delivered. But and also we are tired of its oppressive element of the Limat itself. So we have witnessed Biltsegna as a concept emerging following the popular protest, and nobody anticipates how is it a post-developmental state coming? It is a post-development period which is coming. The post-Limat political episode is evolving. People were thinking, so Biltsegna came to replace and to renew Limat as a concept. So it is too sudden for me, I think, and it is visible, the suddenness of this term is very visible, but yet to know, yet we have to wait, we have to get more history to be studied, to be engaged, and we see from the palace, from the state itself, and from the society. So in connection with the sociology of this concept, this paper doesn't have any its preoccupation with ethnography of the state discourse. It doesn't do ethnography of or a sociological understanding of the term. I only trace it with a connection, etymological connection, and some of as you know, most of such terms, concepts such as Limat, Selitani, Biltsegna, and so on, they have their social meaning. So I didn't do this ethnography or asking people what do they feel about it. Rather, I do the dictionary meaning of these terms and or also liturgical meaning of these terms, and see how they become political concepts. In relation to the, again, Fuad's question again, come back about these transnational connections. Yes, starting from Sra'at, Selitani, all terms has some kind of connection with global political dynamics, even conceptual usage such as Limat development. But in this conversation between the local and the transnational, the global, there is a process of translation. And I'm not interested about origin, by the way. I am studying how these things are emerged into the political landscape. Rather than searching for origin, I document the emergency and what these concepts do to us, to our politics, and so on. If we trace the origin, it is we disappear in the abysm. So I really underline the connection, the Pentecostalism, positive and the future utopian imagination with the developmental state project, the book and the developmental state project. And also it is not only particular to the Pentecostalism, it's also Orthodox imagination of the coming of a better time in the future before the coming of the doomsday. So there is a kind of secular lines which are inscribed into the religiosity of these discourses. So these secular elements, these emancipatory discourses, probably written from below, from the masses, because it is about, for example, it has land distribution, it has equality, it has this land question, which we talk about the revolutionary moment. We have also in religious utopia, we have these questions of national equality, questions of distribution, questions of justice, questions of harmony, emancipation are written in the grammar and vocabulary of religiosity. So how these emerged in Ethiopia and how these discourses, create conversation with the global nuances and meanings and concepts, particularly Limat. So Limat has been used as a depoliticizing term everywhere. And Leseto, James Ferguson told us how it depoliticized, but it doesn't tell us how the masses use the same term, appropriate, for example, translate, subvert, or own the same term to do their own politics. Ferguson doesn't tell us. But what I do in my genealogy, how the same term, development, Limat, Selitani, or Biltsegna could be used by the mass, by the revolutionary subject, the protest subject, to appropriate, to subvert the same power which tries to repoliticize them. So this aspect of power is not total, even if it tries to be total. There is fragmentation, there is fracture, which Sorafil used really loves this term. So this fracture, the mass could speak. So this translation is really I am interested in translating, not only in the language translation, but meaning, philosophy, and usage of these terms, whether they emerge in Brazil, whether they emerge in the US. So what I see in the Bilzigana is it is not being used for neoliberal projects. For the last 2 years, what we have seen is, even if there is a rhetoric of harmony, a rhetoric of, even for example, privatization of big companies and so on, those privatization languages come to an end and reversed by the same power. So Ethiopian economic nationalism is reasserting. For example, the plan to sell Ethiopian Airlines has been cancelled. The plan to privatize all state-owned enterprise has been cancelled. So this shows us continuity and rebranding of the Ethiopian developmental state than neoliberal tendencies, which we have experienced in the moment of openings. So these openings has potentiality and the possibility, and we celebrated the mass celebrated these openings at the beginning. But gradually we see insecurities, we see the limitation of this transition, these openings, similar to other openings, for example, the 1974 openings, because of lack of roadmap, because of lack of agreement between the Ethiopian political elite, because of short-sightedness, because of the ruling class interest of, not to listen, not to embrace the question of the mass. We see more limitation than possibility as we live through the political openings and transition.
Yeah, I think this is. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yoni. I think we are left with almost 6 minutes. So let's attempt, some of the questions. This question, it's a little bit broader, comes from Robel Teklab. I would like to read it. This is for Jonas. Some have argued that the 60s and 70s generation who are of leftist orientation may have had the same vocabularies for their affirming versions of Edget or Limat, while they are deployed a condemning word of Hala Qarnet or backwardness for their preceding eras, wisdom and generations along the line of the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia. This may have yielded tragic results in trying to build a new disconnected from traditional wisdom. It's a connected kind of words. I would like to read it again. This may have yielded tragic results in trying to build a new disconnected from traditional wisdom type of society in Eritrea. The disconnect may not have been that big in Ethiopia. At any rate, how much of the current change of vocabulary to Bilzigana in Ethiopia is also generational, given that Abiy is not from the older generation. For Nazi, I think this question that came from, sorry, I should read it, from John Mellors, even though Fuad already gave an answer to this person through the Q&A section, I think it's also important for the larger audience to get the sense of it. Mellors asked that there seems to be some confusion over the 1967 date. I assume you are referring to 1967, in parentheses, 1959 Ethiopian, when the Ethiopian army in fighting the Eritrean guerrillas was responsible for destroying several villages. The worst massacre taking place in Hazemo rather than the Wekediba, sorry if I didn't pronounce it correctly, massacre of the 1975. Do you think that there was any confusion between the various massacres in the oral accounts you heard? These are the questions. I think in the remaining minutes, we can stop them and we can conclude our tonight's session. Today's session. Please, Nazi or Jonas. Nazi, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think Professor Fuad has already responded.
So yes, it's because I wanted, the larger audience to see it.
Yes. Yeah. So it's not actually a misrepresentation of 1959. As I said, it's actually the memories were pertinent to Asmara, and it was January 23, 1975 or 74. because it depends, like Fuad was saying, like that's, I sometimes call it 70, but it's, I think 75. So it's not related to the event that you are mentioning. It's actually 1966 or 67 or 75. And I think it's also important to not in Gorokian calendar, but in Ethiopian or Eritrean or whatever character, because that's what they've said. And I think for memory, we have to be very sensitive in the dates of those oral accounts that has come, both in the oral and archival. These are the dates which are given. And if we see the oral accounts as commemorative accounts of a violent moment, and taking 1967 seriously without translation is a very necessary act.
Thank you so much. Yoni, we need to be very brief. I may urge you as a friend, to finish it in a couple of minutes.
Okay. Yes, I think it's Rob Elias. But I consider that I have this manifesto of the Communist Party during the that time, which dominantly use the concept of Edget, not Lemat, not Seletsane, and it is the rereading of the Ethiopian history through the Marxist lenses. So I think Marxism, unless we really parochialize or ridicule it, it anticipates a very harmonious political project at the end of the class struggle. So it is not simply narrating contradiction every time. So yes, it reads Ethiopian history in the past through contradiction, but it tries to resolve it through bringing socialism and Edget. So when Edget comes, that contradiction will come to an end. That is its political ideology. And I don't think it is too generational. It is ideological, and it's also political subjectivity, which informs who reads and what acts each generation or each individual does. But Abiy, yes, it is not from the student movement generation. He's a new generation, but it doesn't mean that every generation of our time is not Marxist or neoliberal or liberal. It is about intellectual project, intellectual or political subjectivity, how one read history and tries to contribute to history matters most than generational. We have old liberal, neoliberal subjects, and we have young Marxist subjects in Ethiopian politics. So yeah, I don't think it is that much generational gap. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you addressed Isaias's question in your first, I think, answer, but I think it would be good if we can come back to it, so in the interest of the larger audience, and that may end our discussion. So let me read it. Isaias writes, "I'm impressed by your epistemological orientation." This is to Jonas. "Your interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach and use of mixed methods. However, your analysis for me seems simplistic and reductionist." These are, you spoke to it, but his argument is, it is not essentialist. Isn't it essentialist to associate Biltzigana necessarily with EPRDF, Lemat, and Edget? Is that not reductionist to assume that individuals cannot be creative and come up with a solution to the problem facing the country? Can we not consider your argument itself as a discourse that is instituted to us associate essentially ideas that do not necessarily relate? Social processes are not linear, and the continuity and conceptual relationship are not straightforward as you suggested. They are embodied in conflict and contradiction, and sometimes connection and continuity. I think your analysis has not captured complexities. I wish I could talk that you for the thought-provoking presentation. So this comes from Isaias Bekkele Galata.
Okay, yeah, I've seen that one, and it's a little bit comparison of simplicity and complexity, and the person read and see my presentation a very simplistic, but his own as a very complex, as he speaks from Europe, Vancouver, and so on. So this is a very, this is a scholarship. I speak from archives, from documents, from analysis of conceptual history, and so on. own. I'm not speaking like a journalist from my mind. My stories, my data, my archives inform that there is continuity. And we can't deny that the prime minister and some of his officials are from EPRDF. The mass of the members of the Prosperity Party is from EPRDF. This is historical, even if it sounds very simplistic for Isaias. It is historical that Abiy is the core of EPRDF. Yes, so his subjectivity is formed through EPRDF revolutionary democracy projects. So I am not saying that this discourse is not silencing his thinking subject. I always consider discourses and thinking subjects. So Abiy could be a thinking subject trying to speak to the discourse, coming up with a new language, with this new concept, but still speaking the same discourse with a different language. So the discourse of developmentalism remain constant, even if the thinkers change, even if the concepts change. Ethiopian nationalism, we hear from the prime minister, but even if with his own simplistic language, concepts, and so on, but his Ethiopian nationalism, Ethiopian state developmentalism, still we hear it. So he is a product of Ethiopian state developmentalism. I mean, his projects of mega projects, Shaggar projects are also planned within the EPRDF time. So he implemented the Shaggar project with his own power of implementing power, executive power. But the plan was during the EPRDF period. In Addis Ababa project, the Riverside project was part of EPRDF developmental state project. So this new urban renewal is not his individual creativity. Yes, his creativity is there, but it's also the product of the discourse and institutional apparatus of EPRDF in the developmental state. So I'm not saying this and that. Rather, I think Mr. Isaias' presentation is more simplistic when he says this is individual, it is not a discursive, it is not an institutional. What I am saying is it is an institutional continuity from EPRDF to prosperity. It is discursive continuity from developmental state to Biltzegana. It is also a continuity with the individual subject thinking and acting the prime minister and his office. Thank you. Sorry, I think it's enough here.
No, it's all right. It's all right. What if one argues, for instance, of course, this state developmentalism has got its own continuities, but at the same time, how can we say it is a developmentalist state kind of continuity while the revolutionary democracy that informs the state developmentalism in the TPLF EPRDF has been totally erased from the current discourse, so how can you account for that? And how can we keep the tension? And what do ruptures and continuities do? I think what is that matters when we talked about formation of subjectivities here.
Yes, it's important. I have to take these more questions into to consider when I revise the paper. But I mean, the revolutionary democracy, it is not the rhetoric. What it does to Ethiopian politics, to Ethiopian political economy, is what has been done in the last 2 years. I mean, in terms of mega project, for example, there is a continuity. So mega project is a very good ethnographic, historical, political, ethnographic material to think about what such state developmentalism does to Ethiopian politics. So this state developmentalism, these mega projects continued in a very, expanded. A state is selling bread. It is becoming more a nanny state now. So it's selling bread, opening bread shops here and there. So it is trying to give everything to the society. It is objectifying the state to its development project. This is continuity, even if it is happening in a very liberalized, emerging party politics, debates and media flourishing here and there. The revolutionary democracy, political economic imaginations are continued. So there is no departure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the robust discussion. Netzanet ገብረ Michael, Jonas Ashene. The conversation will continue in different spaces, in different times. So
thank you for your very hot, for hosting us in a very engaging way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes, with this, I would like to invite Satan to close and, to say a few words about tomorrow's sessions. Thank you so much, all the attendees, all the panelists.
Thank you all so much for the very engaging discussion. This talk concludes today's program for the conference. And we will resume tomorrow, Sunday, the 25th of October at 5 p.m. UAE local time for the final day of the conference with 2 sessions. The first one is titled Diasporic Ethiopia, Migration and Exile, and is moderated by Professor Dagmawi Wubshet, and will be joined by Sahin Tefera, founder of the Sitawit movement, Asnake Kefale, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations in Addis Ababa University, and Dagmawi Ymer, who is the filmmaker and co-founder of Migrant Memory Archive in Italy. The second session of that day is a keynote speech by Adam Getachew, Newbar Family Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. We would like to remind you all to register to attend these panels through our website. And for participants in the conference, please use the panelist links that we've shared with you to log in. Thank you all again for today's sessions, and we hope to see you all tomorrow.